Hi everyone, this is my classroom library equity audit presentation and I'm Mackenzie Brow. The books I chose to report on were Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, Percy Jackson the Lightning Thief by Rick Riordan, Bleachers by John Grisham, The Dead and the Gone by Susan Beth Pfeffer, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, Left to Tell by Immaculée Ilibegaza, and Lord of the Flies by William Golding. Throughout my collection, I noticed that there was not a lot of inclusive representation. All of my main characters throughout my 8 books were white, and there were not a lot of main characters of color, and even less main characters with different cultural backgrounds than the white main characters. In this section, I noticed that there was a lot of negative connotation around the women in my books. They were always helpless and they needed the help of a man, or they were very over-sexualized in my books, and they needed the attention of the male character or the attention of another character. It was a common theme throughout my books to see that the characters of color were not the protagonists or the heroes. Most of the time, they were the villains and the antagonists. They were not in the bigger roles in my books, and they were mostly shown as oppressed or in slavery or in need of help and just the very large minority group. The data I collected about families was very widespread. There were a lot of nuclear families in all my books, multi-generational families in some of my books, multiracial, adoptive, non-biological, temporary. It was just all across the board. It wasn't common. So the spread of books that I chose were just very, very different and various. There was a common unoriginality in storylines throughout my books. I feel like we've seen a lot of these types of stories before, or I've heard of them, so none of them were really new or attention grabbing. I did notice that number 5 on this sheet was not included in any of my books, which was advocating for the passive or unquestioned acceptance of inequality, which I found very interesting because usually you will see storylines that follow other storylines or ones that you have heard before. I also found this data extremely interesting because we see stereotypes in some or many or most of my books throughout every one of these checklists, every one of these bullet points on this checklist, except stereotypes with white people. I find this very interesting because you see stereotypes every day and you hear about them and you notice them with your own eyes. But throughout the 8 books that I chose, there were no stereotypes of white people. Mostly other people, like people with stereotypes of people with their age, with their body type, their poverty level, their language, their religion. It's just all around, but we don't see any with white people. That's just very interesting to me. In section 7, we look at authenticity, and we can say that there's not a lot of authenticity throughout my books. There's some in majority of the books, but not many or most in a handful of the books. So there's not a lot of represented or accurate information in my books because most of them are made before 2000. Only 2 or 3 of my books were made after 2000, and as far as from 2013. None have been since 2013. So there's a lot of older information and information that's not up to date. Now to dig deeper in my findings, what conclusions can you draw from analyzing your collection with the above factors? I can conclude that the collection of books heavily spotlights white protagonists and traditional family models. I see a limited representation of marginalized groups, specifically people with disabilities or various religious backgrounds. Some of the newer books touch on issues of injustice and even people of color, but not drastically. I noticed that many books in the collection lack authenticity, like I said before, and risk bearing stereotypes as well. In my opinion, most of these books could be more inclusive to current norms. If a teacher was using the set of books I selected, what could someone infer about the classroom culture? After reflecting on the books I chose, someone might infer that the classroom values heavily on traditional and historical literature, While there is some diversity presented in the collection, these books don't greatly prioritize minoritized culture. So I would say that there's a strong presence in the dominant perspective, but not a lot in the minoritized perspective, and the classroom collection that I chose may need to be updated greatly. Explain the impact of students seeing their and others' lives positively reflected in curriculum and classroom materials. Thinking about self-efficacy and self-concept. So when students see their lives positively reflected in curriculum and classroom culture materials, they'll feel a sense of belonging and their self-esteem will ultimately be boosted. They'll feel valued and understood in their safe learning environment when they see how their peers share the same characteristics and qualities as the peers in the classroom materials. They'll learn a sense of empathy and new perspectives for those people. It's very important to have an inclusive classroom. Which text from your collection presents a positive framing of a specific population? How does it provide this framing? I believe that Left to Tell by Immaculée Elibigeza provides a positive framing of a Rwandan woman who survives a mass genocide. She finds strength through her faith as well as resilience along the way. The book portrays her as a powerful individual who overcomes great adversities, rather than being just a victim and having a victim mindset. It offers a message of hope and forgiveness. The story highlights a specific cultural context and intensity with humanity. I was challenged to describe two very different classroom settings. What important lessons would be learned by the students in classroom A if this classroom library were used, and what important lessons would be learned by the students in classroom B if this classroom library were used? Classroom A could be a predominantly group of the dominant students who might use this collection to gain insight into social and cultural issues. They might get a new sense of empathy through books like Fahrenheit 451 and To Kill a Mockingbird. Classroom B, on the other hand, might be students who mostly come from diverse backgrounds and have very little representation. They may relate to some of the characters and storylines in the collection of books. They may also gain a new sense of engagement and support from within their communities. Next, explain how literature reflects and influences culture. Well, literature has a great influence on the reflection and influences of culture. First of all, strong beliefs, values, and struggles are reflected throughout these works. It also influences culture by impacting on how people perceive others and understand their social norms and their history. Literature has the power to alter stereotypes while exploring different identities and traditions of various groups. It has the ultimate power to persuade a massive social change among its readers. Finally, identify an aspect of your classroom library that relates to living in a multicultural society. How is that aspect reflected in society more broadly? Well, Left to Tell is an example of my collection that relates to living in a multicultural society. It tells the story of a Rwandan woman who survives a genocide. This is reflected in society more broadly because this book mirrors global interrelation as well as immigrant narratives. There's a forceful recognition of international voices and the importance of learning from global historical cultures. Thank you for taking the time to watch my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. And that's all.